Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window sewing, and the frame of the window was made of black ebony. And whilst she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of red thread fell upon the snow. The red looked pretty upon the white snow, and she thought to herself, "Would that I had a child as white as snow, as red as this thread, and as black as the wood of the window frame." Soon after that, she had a little daughter who was as white as snow, as red as thread, and her hair was as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Little Snow White. And when the child was born, the queen passed away. After a year had passed, the king took another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else could surpass her in beauty. She had a wonderful mirror, and when she stood in front of it and looked at herself in it, she said, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, O Queen, are the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the mirror spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up and became more and more beautiful. And when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day, and more beautiful than the queen herself. And once when the queen asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it answered, "You are fair, my queen. It is true, but Snow White is even fairer than you." Then the queen was shocked and filled with envy. From that hour, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart felt heavy with jealousy. Envy and pride grew stronger in her heart like a weed, so that she had no peace day or night. She called a huntsman and said, "Take the child away into the forest. I will no longer have her in my sight. Make sure she stays there and never returns." The huntsman obeyed and took her away, but when he saw Snow White's innocent face, he felt pity for her and said, "Run away then, you poor child. Find a safe place in the forest and stay hidden." Snow White thanked him and ran deeper into the forest. The huntsman felt relieved that he didn't have to harm her and decided to bring back a token of his trip. He found a young deer, collected some leaves and berries, and brought them to the queen, telling her that Snow White was gone for good. But now the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and so terrified that she looked at all the leaves on the trees and did not know what to do. Then she began to run and ran over sharp stones and through thorns, and the wild animals ran past her, but did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would carry her until it was almost evening. Then she saw a little cottage and went inside to rest. Everything in the cottage was small but neater and cleaner than can be described. There was a table with a white cover, 7 little plates, and on each plate a little spoon. Additionally, there were 7 little knives and forks and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds side by side, each covered with snow-white blankets. Little Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate a few vegetables and a bit of bread from each plate and drank a drop of juice from each mug, for she did not wish to take everything from just one. Then, as she was so tired, she lay down on one of the little beds, but none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short, but at last she found that the 7th one was just right, and so she stayed in it, said a prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 dwarfs who dug and delved in the mountains for ore. They lit their 7 candles, and as it was now light within the cottage, they saw that someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" The third, "Who has been taking some of my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking out of my mug?" Then the first looked around and saw that there was a little hollow on his bed, and he said, "Who has been getting into my bed?" The others came up and each called out, "Somebody has been lying in my bed too." But the seventh, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep therein. He called the others, who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment and brought their 7 little candles and let the light fall on little Snow White. "Oh heavens, cried they, "what a lovely child!" And they were so glad that they did not wake her up, but let her sleep on in the bed. The 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so passed the night. When it was morning, little Snow White awoke, and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs. But they were friendly, and asked her what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How have you come to our house?" said the dwarfs. Then she told them that her stepmother had wished to have her taken away, but that the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had run for the whole day until she had found their dwelling. The dwarfs said, "If you will take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and if you will keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." And she stayed with them. She kept the house in order for them. In the mornings they went to the mountains to look for copper and gold, and in the evenings they came back, and then their supper had to be ready. The girl was alone the whole day, so the good dwarfs warned her and said, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Be sure to let no one come in." But the queen, believing that she had gotten rid of Snow White, thought that she was again the first and most beautiful of all. She went to her looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass, looking-glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking-glass never spoke falsely, and she realized that the huntsman had betrayed her, and that little Snow White was still alive. And so she thought, and thought again about how she might ensure that Snow White would never trouble her again, for as long as Snow White was the fairest in the whole land, envy gave her no rest. Finally she devised a plan, disguised herself as an old peddler woman, and no one could have recognized her. In this disguise she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs' cottage, knocked at the door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White looked out of the window and called out, "Good day, my good woman, what have you to sell?" "Good things, pretty things," she answered, "stay laces of all colours," and she pulled out one which was woven of bright-coloured silk. "I may let the worthy old woman in," thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look. Come, I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion, but stood before her and let herself be laced with the new laces. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fainted. "You are the most beautiful," said the queen to herself, and ran away. Not long afterward, in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, but they were shocked when they saw their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, not moving and looking as if she were lifeless. They lifted her up, and seeing that she was laced too tightly, they carefully loosened the laces. Slowly, she began to breathe again, and after a while, she came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else but the wicked queen. Take care and let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked queen, when she had reached home, went in front of her mirror and asked, looking-glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the mirror answered as before, "O Queen, Thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard that, all her blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that little Snow White was alive again. "But now," she said, "I will think of something that will truly put an end to you." And by using her knowledge of magic, she made a poisonous comb. Then she disguised herself and took the shape of another old woman. Once again she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs' cottage, knocked at the door and cried, "Good things to sell cheap, cheap." Little Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I cannot let anyone come in." "I suppose you can look," said the old woman, and pulled the poisonous comb out and held it up. It pleased the girl so much that she let herself be tempted and opened the door. When they had made a bargain, the old woman said, "Now I will comb your hair properly for once." Poor little Snow White had no suspicion and let the old woman do as she pleased, but hardly had she put the comb in her hair than the poison in it took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "you are done for now." And she went away. But fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as if dead, they at once suspected the stepmother, and they found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself and told them what had happened. Then they warned her once more to be on her guard and to open the door to no one. The queen at home went in front of her mirror and asked, looking glass, on the wall, "Who in this land is the fairest of all?" Then it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard the glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White shall be gone," she cried, "even if it costs me my life." Thereupon she went into a quiet, secret room where no one ever came, and there she made a very poisonous apple. On the outside it looked pretty, white with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it. But whoever ate a piece of it would fall into a deep sleep. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and dressed herself up as a farmer's wife. Then she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs' cottage. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me." "It is all the same to me," answered the woman. "I shall soon get rid of my apples. Here, I will give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the old woman. "Look, I will cut the apple into 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the fine apple, and when she saw that the woman ate part of it, she could resist no longer and stretched out her hand to take the poisoned half. But hardly had she taken a bite when she fell down, as if dead. Then the queen looked at her with a dreadful look, laughed aloud and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood. This time the dwarfs cannot wake you up again." And when she asked the looking-glass at home, looking glass, on the wall, "Who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered at last, "O Queen, in this land thou art fairest of all." Then her envious heart had rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer and seemed lifeless. They lifted her up, looked to see if they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair and washed her with water, but it was all of no use. The poor child was still and remained still. They laid her upon a bier, and all 7 of them sat around it and wept for her for 3 days. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she were living, and still had her pretty red cheeks. They said, "We could not bury her in the dark ground," so they had a transparent coffin of glass made, so that she could be seen from all sides. They laid her in it and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, adding that she was a king's daughter. Then they placed the coffin upon the mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it. Birds also came to mourn for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and finally a dove. Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change but looked as if she were asleep, for she was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest and went to the dwarf's house to spend the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain and the beautiful Snow White inside it. He read what was written upon it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Please, let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honour and cherish her as my dearest treasure." As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity on him and gave him the coffin. The king's son had it carried away by his servants on their shoulders. But it happened that they stumbled over a tree stump, and with the shock the poisonous piece of the apple that Snow White had bitten off came out of her throat. She opened her eyes, lifted the lid of the coffin, sat up, and was once more alive. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, "You are with me." And he told her what had happened and said, "I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace. You shall be my wife." And Snow White was willing, and she went with him, and their wedding was held with great show and splendour. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also invited to the feast. When she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she went before her looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass, looking-glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "O Queen, of all here the fairest art thou, but the young queen is fairer by far as I trow." Then the wicked woman uttered a curse and was so wretched, so utterly wretched that she did not know what to do. At first, she did not want to go to the wedding at all, but she had no peace and felt compelled to see the young queen. When she arrived, she recognized Snow White and stood still with rage and fear, unable to move. But Snow White forgave her stepmother, and the wedding proceeded joyfully. The stepmother realized her mistakes, repented, and tried to become a better person. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after, their love a shining example to all in the land.